Hello everyone. If you're new to this channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. This video is all about aperture. What is aperture, you may ask? Aperture is very important in astronomy. It's one of the cornerstones of telescopes, visual, astrophotography, you name it, aperture is important. It is important in telescope decision making. It's important in what type of telescope you might take or use on a particular night. Aperture is very, very important. But at its core, it's simply how much light your telescope can collect, or I'm not even going to say telescope, your telescope, binoculars, cameras, your eyes can collect in order to generate an image. And usually when people think of aperture, they literally think, okay, I need to collect as much light as possible. I need to get the biggest telescope possible. But there's a cost. So this video is all about me going into how aperture plays into decision making as it relates to what type of telescope you would like to get, especially if you're new to astronomy. So if you're interested in such content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy the video. You're looking for a new telescope, and you're trying to decide what to get and how to determine whether it will be a good telescope or not. And when you talk to people in astronomy, or even talk to the sales representative, you'll hear a common word: aperture. Aperture, aperture, aperture. What is aperture? Well, aperture is, in essence, a very simple concept. It's the size of the lens that determines how much light you, or the telescope, or it could be you, because your eyes have an aperture, how much light that you, a camera, a lens, can collect. And that is very important because the brighter the object, the more light you can collect, and the clearer or better the image that you will be able to see, because you will be able to connect your telescope, or your eyes will be able to collect enough light to basically create an image, more or less. And when it comes to object in astronomy, the brighter the object, the better the image, more or less, or the less time it will take to get a good image. Which is why, if you're in a city, it's much easier to take pictures of the planets, the moon, even the sun. Again, if you're going to look at the sun, make sure you have the proper equipment to look at the sun. Never look at the sun unaided. But the brighter the object, the easier it is to collect an image. And therefore, that can determine how much of a telescope that you get. Because the larger the object is, the more light it can collect, and that comes with a trade-off. So let's say you're in the city, and you're interested in a telescope, and you don't see yourself going to any dark sites, which I will talk about later, but you're not interested in going in dark sites. You just really want to go out into your backyard, or your roof, or your deck, and look at stuff. Well, that is pros and cons. So the pro is you don't have to drive hours to get to a dark site to look at an image. The con is you're dealing with light pollution. And I'm looking at my cat trying to play with something. So if you see myself diverted, that's why. But the con is you have to deal with light pollution, which means you have to deal with street lights, car lights, buildings, all flooding the night sky, which makes it harder for a lot of astronomical objects to be seen. Well, how can you resolve that? You can either resolve it with getting a large telescope that will allow you to collect light, as much light as possible from an image, or you can, if you're into astrophotography, you can get a telescope, target, and just focus on that object, and follow and track that object throughout the night sky, collecting light. and eventually you'll come back a few hours later and render an image. That doesn't sound that appealing. So what they will tell you is, if you want to do stuff like that, just visual astronomy, you need a large telescope. But that comes with a price. So when it comes to aperture, it is all about size. So you have this pair of binoculars. This is an aperture. Not that great, not that large, is it? So you want to use these if you don't have a lot of light, or at least don't have a lot of light pollution in the sky that would flood the natural light from the astronomical object in the night sky. Which is why I often say, if you're going to a dark site, all you really need is a pair of binoculars. Same thing with a camera. Camera has an aperture. Now this is 58 millimeters. Anyway, with a camera, you can actually get different lenses. You can take it off and you can put lenses on, or larger lenses on, so you can control the aperture. But but you can see naturally it's not that large of an object. It's not that the aperture of this particular lens is not that great. Now, you're interested in telescopes, so let's go to telescopes. This is my NexStar 8 SE, and this is 8 inches, an 8-inch aperture. And the good thing about my NexStar is that you can, as I keep saying throughout these videos, you can pretty much see most objects from the city in the night sky with this telescope. You can see galaxies, although it will look like a blob, especially the Andromeda galaxy. But you can see it. You can see nebulas. You can see the Orion Nebula with this. Now, I've seen this in the DC area, which is, let's say, full of light pollution. You can see planets. You can see, I was able to see the Ring Nebula. You can see pretty much all the different types of objects that you will want to see in the night sky with this telescope. But they might not be, as I mentioned with the Andromeda galaxy, it would be the form of a blob, basically a light blob. But the trade-off is that the aperture is small, well, relatively speaking. It can't collect a lot of light visually. But see how nice and light and portable it is? That's the trade-off. You're saving size of the aperture for mobility. My next telescope, as it relates to aperture, is something that I use if I want to see galaxies and I'm not going to a completely dark site. This is my 12-inch Dobsonian Telescope. You can see it's pretty big, but it's 12 inches. The aperture is pretty big. But again, there's a trade-off. So my sacrificing being able to collect more light, the trade-off is it's pretty big. It is a pretty big telescope, which means it's heavy, which means it's complicated to move it around, to go up and down stairs, to put it into the car, to assemble it. That's the trade-off of getting a large aperture. So if you're in the market for a telescope and you're like, I want to go, let me back up. This is why it's very important when you're looking for a telescope to determine what you want to look at and what you want to do, whether you're in the visual astronomy or in astrophotography. Because if you're just I'm interested in looking at planets, the moon, and that's it, planetary astronomy, then you do not need a large telescope because the planets and the moon generate enough light that a small aperture telescope can see it just fine. If you're into, well, I'm not interested in seeing the planets. I'm interested in seeing galaxies, nebulas, star clusters. Then you need a large aperture telescope because from the city, and the light pollution will wash out a lot of the light generated by these objects. So you need a large enough telescope in order to be able to visually see them. And as I mentioned, my next star, 8 inches, can see a lot of them. It might not be able to be presented in great detail, but you would be able to see them. So I was able to see star clusters, galaxies, nebulas. I was able to see all that. And then I will have the option of going out to a dark site because it's portable and I can see it in better detail. But another option to you, if you're not interested in portability, then you can go ahead and get a large aperture telescope because then you're maximizing the amount of light being generated by the astronomical objects, regardless of light pollution. But then, what if you're interested in astrophotography? Well, if you're interested in astrophotography, you might be thinking, oh, I need to get a large telescope so I can take an image and be able to put it in great detail that I can send to my friends. Well, not necessarily. So, and when it comes to astrophotography, you're tracking the object across the night sky. All that tracking is generating light, is collecting light. So you can get by with a smaller telescope. You just have to track it longer than it would be with a larger telescope. But oftentimes, in order to track it successfully, you need a smaller telescope. So that's a trade-off when it comes to astrophotography. So that's why I keep going back to, if you're interested in a telescope, you have to make the determination as to what you are interested in seeing. If you're interested in planets, the moon, even the sun with the proper equipment, you don't need a large telescope. You can get by with a relatively small aperture telescope and you can see them just fine. If you're into visual astronomy and you want to see galaxies, nebulas, star clusters, and you're not interested in traveling or going to dark sites, then you probably need to get a larger aperture telescope because you're not interested in mobility and you need to collect enough light from these objects to compensate for the light pollution in order to see the objects well, which for me would probably be 8 inches and above. Now, if you're interested in visual astronomy and you're willing to travel to a dark site with low light pollution, then you can get a smaller telescope, which to me would be like 8 inches and below. You see, the sweet spot is 8 inches to me. And you can still see the objects well, but then you're willing to travel to a dark site. Now, what if you're interested in astrophotography? Again, it comes back to how much time you're willing to track an object. Now, for astrophotography, you need a smaller telescope, which is really anything like 4 inches or even smaller to really track these objects. You can kind of do it with an 8-inch, but an 8-inch is really large when it comes to astrophotography. You usually want something much, much smaller. And as I said, aperture is enough light you need to collect. So again, it comes back to what you're willing to do with astrophotography. And it really just comes down to how much time you're willing to track the object. If you're doing it from the city, you have to track it for a longer period of time because you have less aperture, you're not collecting enough light. You have to track the object for a long enough time to, in essence, collect enough light in order to generate an image. Whereas if you go to a dark site, it will take much less time to get enough light to get enough light to generate an image. So that's aperture. It's simple, right? I'm really trying to break it down, not really going into the scientific calculations and formulas for it. But in essence, or in summary, aperture is just the size of the lens. Anything from your eye to binoculars to cameras to telescopes, the size of the lens that can help or does determine how much light a particular object collects in order to generate an image. And that's it. And when you're going out trying to look for a telescope, think about that and think about what you're willing to look at, what you want to look at, and use that to guide you in picking a good telescope for you or your family. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you again.